Welcome to scenario planning. Why do scenario planning? Well, we live in an incredibly complex world, becoming more complex every day. Some people call it a VUCA world, volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous. How are we supposed to plan for a future in this kind of world? Well, we need to use our imaginations, and that's where rather scenario planning comes in. Oftentimes, the human brain, it's just wired to think that the future is going to be just like today. If the sky is sunny right now, well, we just kind of think it's going to continue to be sunny. But the fact is, we do not know what we don't know. We really don't know what the future brings. But it's helpful to think about it because it helps us prepare. And if we are prepared for some of the different possibilities that are out there, our organization might have a really great opportunity. And we'll be ready to capitalize on whatever that opportunity is. So, what are scenarios, or what is scenario planning? Well, it's possible views of the world described in narrative form. So, it's a story. Here's a story of what could happen in the future. The next one says they help create a vision for the organization. So, we start imagining some things that could happen in the future and how would react to that as an organization. And all of a sudden we realize, hey, that might be a good thing for us to do no matter what, even if this scenario doesn't happen. They help managers make decisions and mitigate for change. So if we imagine something really horrible happening in the future, like not having any customers because of some huge demographic change, and we think of ways to mitigate for that, we might realize, hey, that would be a really good idea to change our marketing strategy, for instance, even if we are going to have lots of customers in the future. And at the end here, it's important to understand that scenario planning is not strategic planning. In fact, it really shouldn't be called scenario planning. It should be called scenario learning because it's not a plan per se. It's thinking about the future. And then it can lead to strategic planning. A strategic plan is what the organization is actually planning on doing. This is just using your imagination. So with that in mind, it's important to understand that a good set of scenarios is not, they weren't good because they actually turned out to truly portray the future. A really good scenario planning session means that it enabled the organization to learn, adapt, and to take effective action for whatever future ends up happening. So when we think about the things that we want to imagine for our scenarios, we're looking at this bracket that says plausible. We're not looking at what's probable. We need to plan for what's probable no matter what. And we're not really looking at everything that's possible. We're looking at things that, that's something that actually could happen. So here is a scenario planning process that I like. There are all sorts of scenario planning processes. You don't have to necessarily follow this one, but this is one that I will show you. And I'm going to start with this first in the upper left where it's blue, a pre-planning process. And that is to develop a focus question. So sometimes we start having a question like, should I hire more employees? And that leads to deciding to do some scenario planning. Well, what are some things that could happen in the future? And so you might have a particular focus, but you don't have to have a particular focus for scenario planning to lead to some great ideas. So the first real step is to look to the outside and look to drivers outside the organization. So this isn't about things that are going to happen inside the organization. This is about things we cannot control that are in the outer environment. And one way to do that is to use the STEEP process, STEEP, social, technological, environmental, economy, and political. And if you have a group of people, you can put these 5 words up on a whiteboard, for instance, in columns, and people can write on sticky notes or they can just say out loud what they're thinking, and somebody can take notes up on the whiteboard in these categories. So you might just first focus on social forces. What are some trends that are happening now that could help us think of things that might happen in the future. So, social trends might be things like demographics. We have an aging population or population in general? Could think about mental health trends in the social world. More and more people having mental health issues, especially young people. Could think about inequities and whether they are going to continue or get worse, or whether an awakening of understanding and viewing inequities and oppression, maybe that'll continue, or maybe there'll be a backlash. So those are a few examples of potential social drivers or social trends. Technology is a huge category. You could think about artificial intelligence, what might happen there. You could think about the virtual conferencing. Is there going to be a lot more virtual conferencing in the future? You could think about all sorts of industries like transportation. What could happen in transportation, like electric cars, for instance, that could completely change the way your organization functions or is affected? You could think about agriculture, genetically modified foods. Technology really can change things. Environmental, there's climate change, there's air quality, there's things like health in the environment. So we are, as I share this, in the middle of a pandemic. Some people predicted and were prepared for it. Many people and organizations were not. What's going on out in the environment, or what could happen? And then economy, you can think about the strength of the economy overall, or is there going to be steep inflation? What would happen if something like that were to come along, or another recession, or globalization could be an economical trend. And then political drivers could be things like laws that could get made. If one particular party gets elected at the state or federal level, how would that change things? International forces, are there tensions internationally that might lead to a war? And as you make these predictions, your group can decide whether you're talking about fairly short term or whether you're doing scenario planning that has to do with 5, 10 years out. And you really want to think about some of the long range drivers that are out there. So the next step is to select some drivers to concentrate on. You're not going to concentrate on all of those possibilities, but as a group, you're going to decide on maybe just two of them. And one way to do that is to take your sticky notes, if you use those, for instance, and you can arrange those into a matrix. So here's an example of a matrix where you have one axis that is impact and one axis that is certainty. How certain is it that these things might happen? So if you take a sticky note that says runaway inflation, and that could be something that could have high impact on your organization, and it could be something that seems like very uncertain, depending on what you decide. So that would be something that would go in the upper right-hand quadrant, something that would have high impact on your organization, something that's very uncertain. Artificial intelligence, like massive artificial, you're in education, if you think artificial intelligence could lead to possibly teachers being replaced, that would have a high impact on your organization. Does it seem less certain or very certain? You would place that sticky note in what quadrant you think it goes in. And you don't have to be exact about this. This is not an exact process, just to get ideas going. And for your scenario planning, you want to choose two of those drivers that seem like they are high impact and pretty uncertain. Now, notice the upper left quadrant, that says critical planning. Those are things that are high impact that seem very certain to happen. Well, those are things you need to be planning for no matter what. Those are not our scenario plannings. Just make sure your organization plans for them. Our scenario planning is for things that are a little more uncertain. So now our next step is to actually start imagining the scenarios. So sometimes it's helpful for an organization to use another matrix, yet another matrix. So you're going to take your two different drivers and put them in a matrix to think about the way the world might look in some different scenarios. So let's say there's going to be really high inflation or low inflation on one axis, and the other axis is there's going to be a really steep curve of artificial intelligence happening, and another axis is people are going to back off and there's not going to be very much artificial intelligence. And you can imagine the four different kinds of worlds of pairing those together in different ways. And you actually want to sort of write a little story together about what that world could look like. And then you use that to imagine what the effects on your organization would be if those things were to happen. Now, sometimes people like to do scenario planning. This is just another option where they actually think of things that don't seem very plausible, but just sort of weigh out their wild cards. Like I read a story about an organization that imagined if Mount St. Helens had exploded again, what would they do? I think it might have been a hospital. And that was a really good example. It seemed really implausible, but it happened. And because they had done the scenario planning, they actually had some plans and some ideas for that. Now, did some people think that a worldwide pandemic of the nature of COVID-19 would happen? They might have thought that was not plausible. They might have thought that was a wild card. But a lot of people thought something like that was plausible, and organizations had planned for it and were ready to adapt. So we'll leave behind wild cards for now. And the last step is to just describe some potential responses. So think about what the world might look like with your potential scenarios, and then how would your organization react, or what would be some good plans the organization would want to have in place to prepare for that? And the first way to think about this is to mitigate risk. So if for instance, if you imagine some things that seem pretty horrible, you might imagine some really awesome things, but you also might imagine some things that are not too fantastic. And how are you going to mitigate risk? Are you going to have cover a full range of options to make sure you got all your bases covered? Are you going to be flexible and just sort of be ready to make a change when the time comes, sort of keep all your options open? Are you going to have multiple coverage, like a scatter shot, of like you're going to just have so many strategies going on, you're ready for anything? Or are you going to gamble? Are you going to choose one or two things that you think really maybe could happen, and you're going to bet the farm on that and move in that direction? Another approach that you should do at the same time are blue sky ideas. So instead of just mitigating for risk, what you do is you just do a brainstorming session of like really outrageous, wild things your organization could do. And don't worry about whether they seem possible or plausible. Like, don't worry about what the budget is, for instance, because sometimes some really great ideas turn up uh, um, when you don't even worry about the barriers at all, and you end up realizing, hey, that's something we actually could do, or that would be a good thing to do, even if our imagined scenario doesn't happen. And then there's one last step that's really after the process, and that's this one. After you've done your scenario planning and you've imagined some ways that your organization could respond, you might look at some of those ideas and ways to mitigate for risk or really blue sky ideas and go, you know what? Those are things our organization should do no matter what. Those are some great ideas. And those are the types of things that you want to consider in your planning process, your strategic planning process going forward. Have fun with strategic planning.